Chapter 38, His Regret. London rain is a different kind of cold. It doesn't just wet the skin, it sinks into the marrow, a gray, relentless reminder of things that refuse to wash away. I stood at the window of our suite at the Dorchester, a glass of amber liquid in my hand that I hadn't touched for an hour. Below, Park Lane was a river of blurred headlights and glistening pavement. For decades, I had stood in rooms like this, overlooking cities like this, feeling like the master of all I surveyed. I had built a life on the premise that regret was a luxury for the weak, a sentiment for people who didn't have the stomach to win. But tonight, the word regret was a heavy, suffocating shroud. I looked back at the bed. Maya was asleep, her breathing a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the drumming of the rain against the glass. She looked so small against the vastness of the silk sheets, so fragile, yet she was the one who had survived the fire, the kidnapping, and my own arrogance. I set the glass down on the mahogany table, my hands shaking slightly. My mind was a projector, looping images I couldn't shut off. I saw the look on her face that first night at the gala, the defiance masked by a desperation I had exploited. I saw the way I had cornered her in my office, using her father's life as a line item in a negotiation. I saw the locked-in contract, the words I had drafted with clinical precision, designed to strip her of her agency and turn her into an extension of the Blackwood machine. I had called it security. I had called it protection. But standing here in the dark, with the weight of my father's lies and my mother's betrayal finally laid bare, I knew what it really was. It was theft. I hadn't just stolen a company, I had tried to steal a soul. A soft movement from the bed broke the silence. Maya sat up, the sheet falling to her waist. In the dim amber light of the street lamps outside, she looked like a portrait of grace and resilience. She rubbed her eyes and looked toward the window, sensing the heavy, static air of my thoughts. Alexander. She whispered, her voice a low, morning-soft rasp. "Why are you standing in the dark?" "I'm exactly where I belong, Maya," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears, cracked and hollow. She got out of bed, the silk of her nightgown whispering against the carpet. She walked toward me, but she didn't touch me at first. She stood just a few feet away, her eyes searching mine. She had become so adept at reading the shadows in me that I couldn't hide even if I wanted to. "It's the fallout, isn't it?" she asked. "You're thinking about the board or your mother?" "No," I said, finally turning to face her. "I'm thinking about the day I met you. I'm thinking about the person I was when I wrote that contract. I'm thinking about how much of a monster I had to become to think that locking you in was an act of love." The regret hit me then, a physical blow to the solar plexus. I sat down heavily in the velvet armchair, burying my face in my hands. "I almost ruined you, Maya. Not just your career, but your spirit. I used every tool in my arsenal to break your no. And I did it while telling myself I was your savior." Maya POV. The silence of the room was heavy with the weight of his confession. I had seen Alexander angry. I had seen him protective. I had seen him desperate. But I had never seen him truly ashamed. He sat in that chair, the man who had owned the room, now looking like a man who was afraid to occupy his own skin. I walked over and knelt between his legs, my hands resting on his knees. I could feel the tension radiating through the expensive wool of his trousers, the rhythmic tremor of a man fighting a war with his own history. "Alexander, look at me," I commanded softly. He pulled his hands away from his face. His eyes were bloodshot, the gray depths clouded with a raw, agonizing pain. "I spoke to Sarah Jenkins today," he whispered, "before you arrived. She told me that I'm still a martyr. She said I'm using my guilt to build another cage, only this time, I'm the one inside it. Sarah is a woman who has every right to be bitter, I said, but she doesn't know the man you've become. But I know the man I was. He shouted, the sound echoing through the suite. He grabbed my wrists, his grip firm but not painful. I looked at the Icarus files again tonight, Maya. The notes my father made when he was dismantling your father's life. He used the exact same phrasing I used with you. Stability, long-term acquisition, risk management. I wasn't just his son, Maya. I was his masterpiece. He taught me how to love by owning, and I almost used that lesson to destroy the only thing that ever made me feel alive. He let go of my wrists and leaned back, his gaze fixing on the ceiling. I regret every second of that first month, he continued, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. I regret the way I looked at you like an asset. I regret the way I made you feel like you had to choose between your dignity and your father's life. I regret that it took an explosion and a kidnapping for me to realize that you were never mine to protect. You were always the one who was supposed to be leading. I reached up and took his face in my hands, forcing him to look at me. Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I haven't spent every night since we got to Zurich replaying the same things? Then how can you stay? He asked, a tear finally escaping and tracking a path through the stubble on his jaw. How can you look at me and not see the man who built the cage? Because I'm the one who broke it, Alexander, I said, my voice steady and fierce. You didn't give me my freedom. I took it. I walked out of that villa in Como. I threw the ring in the lake. I forced you to realize that if you wanted me, you had to meet me on equal ground. I leaned in, my forehead resting against his. Regret is a ghost, Alexander. It only has power if you let it live in the room. I don't want your apologies for the man you were. I want your presence as the man you are. He let out a long, ragged breath that sounded like a sob. He wrapped his arms around my waist and pulled me into his lap, his face burying in the crook of my neck. He held me with a desperate strength, as if he were trying to pull my soul into his own to heal the jagged edges of his conscience. I'm so sorry, Maya, he murmured against my skin. I'm so goddamn sorry for everything. Alexander POV. Her forgiveness was a fire I didn't deserve, but I stood in the heat of it anyway. I held her for a long time, the rain continuing its assault on the window. The regret didn't vanish, I don't think it ever would, but it shifted. It went from a suffocating weight to a foundation. It was the scar tissue of the man I used to be, a reminder of the cost of the Blackwood way. I pulled back just enough to look at her. She was glowing, not with the artificial light of a boardroom, but with a raw, unshielded beauty that made my heart ache. You're the CEO now, I whispered, my thumb tracing the line of her lower lip. You own the tower, you own the code, you own the future. What is your first command, Miss Sterling? Maya smiled, a slow, dangerous, and incredibly seductive expression. My first command is for you to stop thinking about the past for the next hour. I want you to be here, with me, in this room, without the shadows. She reached for the buttons of my shirt. Her movements were slow, deliberate, a testament to the power shift we had finally solidified. She was the one who was locking me in now, but it wasn't with a contract. It was with the sheer, undeniable gravity of her desire. The shirt fell to the floor. I ran my hands over her back, feeling the warmth of her skin through the silk of her gown. The regret was still there, a distant hum in the back of my mind, but it was being drowned out by the roar of the present. I picked her up and carried her back to the bed. This wasn't the frantic, desperate intimacy of the jet or the clinical rescue of the warehouse. This was a slow, sensory exploration of the trust we were rebuilding. I touched her with a reverence that felt like a prayer. I kissed the bruises on her temples, the marks on her wrists, the places where the world and I had tried to break her. Every touch was an apology. Every kiss was a promise. "I love you," I gasped as we moved together, the rhythm of our bodies finally finding a peace the world had denied us. "I know," she whispered, her eyes locked on mine. "And that's the only truth that matters." In the dark of the Dorchester suite, surrounded by the ghosts of my family and the wreckage of my empire, I finally realized the ultimate consequence of my surrender. I hadn't just lost a company. I had found a reason to breathe, and for a man like me, that was the only deal worth keeping. Maya POV, 4 a.m. The room was quiet again, the rain having settled into a soft, melodic mist. Alexander was asleep, his arm draped across my waist in that familiar, possessive grip. But it felt different now. It didn't feel like a claim, it felt like an anchor. He looked peaceful, the lines of regret finally smoothed away by the exhaustion of our connection. I stayed awake, watching the gray light of London begin to bleed through the curtains. I looked at the ring on my finger, the new one, the one that wasn't built on a contract. I knew the war wasn't over. The fallout of Act III was still raining down on us. My mother-in-law was in a cell, Eris Thorne was a bankrupt ghost, and Julian Vane was still a shadow in the wind. The board in New York would still try to pick us apart, and the press would still hunt for the next crack in the foundation. But as I looked at Alexander, I realized that we were no longer separate targets. We were a single, unbreakable force. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I picked it up expecting a message from Marcus or a legal alert. It was a notification from the clinic in Zurich, a video file. I opened it. The camera was positioned at the foot of my father's bed. He was sitting up without the assistance of the nurses. He was looking directly into the lens. "Maya," he said. His voice was thin, raspy, but unmistakable. I felt a sob rise in my throat. I clutched the phone to my chest, the tears finally falling in earnest. "Alexander," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Alexander, wake up." He stirred, his eyes snapping open with the old, lethal alertness. What is it? Is it Vane?" "No," I said, showing him the screen. "It's my father. He's talking, Alexander. He's calling my name." Alexander sat up, his eyes widening as he watched the video. He looked at the screen, then at me, and I saw a look of pure, unadulterated joy break through his professional mask. "He's back, Maya," Alexander whispered, his voice shaking. "The mapping worked. The Factor 4 bridge, it worked." We sat in the dark, watching the video over and over again. My father spoke about the lab, about the light, about the fact that he was finally, truly, awake. And then, at the very end of the video, my father said something else. "Tell the boy, thank you." I looked at Alexander. He was weeping. Not the quiet, controlled tears of a businessman, but the raw, racking sobs of a man who had finally been forgiven by the ghost he had been running from his entire life. The regret was finally, truly broken. We stayed like that until the sun was high over the Thames. We were the CEO and the consultant. We were the Sterling and the Blackwood. But as we walked out of the Dorchester and toward the waiting car, I realized that those titles didn't mean anything anymore. We were just two people who had survived the fire, and we were ready to claim the world. Alexander POV. The flight back to Zurich was a victory lap. I sat at the mahogany table, but I wasn't looking at stock options. I was looking at Maya. She was on a call with the clinical board, her voice authoritative, her mind 10 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. She was magnificent. I felt a surge of pride so strong it was almost dizzying. I had spent my life trying to find something worth owning, only to realize that the most valuable thing in the world was a woman I couldn't control. Marcus walked into the cabin, looking more relaxed than I had ever seen him. "Sir, the New York board has officially ratified the transfer. The civil suits have been dropped, and the SEC has closed the investigation into the 1994 forgery. Eris Thorne has signed a full confession." "And my mother?" I asked. "She's being moved to the facility in Connecticut this afternoon. She sent a message, sir." Marcus handed me a small, handwritten envelope. I opened it. Inside was a single sentence. "You were always a terrible steward, Alexander. You were born to be a king. I just didn't realize you'd find your queen in the wreckage." I crumpled the note and threw it into the trash can. My mother was wrong. I wasn't a king, and Maya wasn't a queen. We were something much more dangerous. We were a partnership built on the truth. I walked over to Maya and wrapped my arms around her from behind, burying my face in her hair. She leaned back into me, her hand finding mine. "We're almost home," she whispered. "We are home," I replied. The fallout was over. Act III was finished. Act IV was the claim. And as the plane banked over the Alps, I realized that I wasn't afraid of the future anymore. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who had to make the rules. I was the one who got to follow them. And the first rule was simple: never let go of the woman who owns the room. Maya POV, end of chapter 38. The Herslinden Clinic was bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon. We walked through the doors, but we didn't go to the lab. We didn't go to the executive suite. We went to my father's room. He was sitting in the armchair by the window, looking out at the lake. He looked older, thinner, but his eyes were bright with a familiar, intellectual fire. When he saw us, he didn't say a word. He just stood up. He walked toward us, his steps shaky but determined. I ran to him, catching him in my arms, the tears finally breaking through. "I'm here, Dad," I whispered. "I'm here." My father pulled back and looked at me, then at Alexander. He reached out and took Alexander's hand, his grip firm. "The science is safe," my father rasped. "The science is yours, Dr. Sterling," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "And it always will be." My father nodded. He looked at our joined hands, then back at me. "Maya," he said. "Yes, Dad." "You owned the room." I laughed, a rich, happy sound that filled the clinic. I looked at Alexander, and I saw the man I loved, the man who had faced his regrets and found his soul. "No, Dad," I said, pulling Alexander closer. "We own the room." The fallout was over. The claim was beginning. And as the sun set over Lake Zurich, casting a long, golden glow over the three of us, I realized that the locked-in era was finally, truly over. We were free. And the world was ours to write. Alexander POV. I watched the sunset with the woman I loved and the man I had spent a decade trying to replace. I felt a peace I hadn't known since I was a child. The regret was a foundation, the fire was a hearth, and the fallout was the fertile soil for a new life. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the Vigil of Justice notebook. I opened it to the last page and wrote 3 words. The claim, ours. I looked at Maya, her face radiant in the dying light. I was Alexander Blackwood. I had lost an empire, a name, and a reputation, and I had never been more successful in my life. Next chapter, chapter 39, her rise.